All right, so today we're talking about the Hundred Year War. The Hundred Year War began in 1337 when the King of France seized the English controlled parts of another territory. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. When the last Capetian king died without a successor, that's when England's Edward III claimed the right to the French throne. The war that Edward III launched for that throne continued off and on from 1337 to 1453, and it became known as the Hundred Year War. During this time, victory is going to pass back and forth between the two countries. Finally, between 1421 and 1453, the French rallied and drove the English out of France completely, except for the port city of Calais. Some things important to know about the Hundred Year War is it brought a change in the style of warfare in Europe. At this time, some combatants still operated under the medieval ideas of chivalry that we talked about earlier in the unit. They looked with contempt on the common foot soldier and archers who fought alongside them. And this is going to change with the introduction of the longbow, which is what we're going to talk about next. The English introduced the longbow and demonstrated its power with three pretty important battles: the Battle of Crécy, the Battle of Poitiers, and the Battle of Agincourt. The first and most spectacular battle was the Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346. The English army, including longbowmen, were outnumbered by a French army 3 times its size. The French army included knights and archers with crossbows, and French knights believed themselves completely invincible, so they attacked. The English longbowmen let fly thousands of arrows at the oncoming French. The crossbowmen, peppered with English arrows, retreated in panic. And the knights trampled their own archers in an effort to cut a path through them. English longbowmen sent volley after volley of deadly arrows. They unhorsed knights, who then lay helplessly on the ground in their heavy armor. They couldn't even get up. And then, using long knives, the English foot soldiers attacked and just slaughtered the French. And at the end of the day, more than a third of the French forces lay dead. Among them were some of the most honored in chivalry. The longbow and not chivalry had won the day. The mounted, heavily armored medieval knight is just soon to be extinct. There's really nothing that it still has. The English repeated their victory 10 years later at the Battle of Poitiers, and the third English victory at the Battle of Agincourt, which is in 1415. And this pretty much spells doom for that group of people at the time. Next, we're going to talk about Joan of Arc, because she's a pretty significant player to this as well. Joan of Arc, in 1420, the French and the English signed a treaty stating that Henry V would inherit the French crown upon the death of the French king Charles VI. Then in 1429, a teenage French peasant girl named Joan of Arc felt moved by God to rescue France from its English conquerors. When Joan was just 13, she began to have visions and hear what she believed were the voices of saints. They urged her to drive the English from France and give the French crown to France's true king, Charles VII. On May 7, 1429, Joan led the French army into battle at the city of New Orleans. The fort blocked the road to Orleans. It was a hard-fought battle for both sides. The French finally retreated in despair, and suddenly Joan and a few soldiers charged back towards the fort. The entire French army stormed after her, and the siege of Orleans was broken. Joan of Arc guided the French onto that path of victory. After the victory, Joan persuaded Charles to go with her to Reims. There he was crowned king, and in 1430, the Burgundians, who are England's allies, captured Joan in battle. They turned her over to the English. The English, in turn, handed her over to the church authorities to stand trial. Although the French king owed his entire crown to Joan, he did nothing to rescue her. She was condemned as a witch and a heretic because of her claim to hear voices. And she was burned at the stake on May 30th. And she was actually burned 3 different times so they could make sure there was no bones left for people to come and gather as trophies. The impact of the Hundred Year War is pretty significant. The war lasted, like I said, from 1337 to 1453 on and off, and both sides experienced major changes. We have a feeling of nationalism that emerges in England and France. People thought of the king as a national leader, fighting for the glory of their country, not simply some lord. The power and the prestige of the French monarch is going to increase, and the English are going to suffer a kind of an internal turmoil. We call it the War of the Roses, as 2 nobles fight for who's going to be their next king. Some consider the end of the Hundred Year War as the end of the Middle Ages. because we kind of seen the wrap-up of this time period, and very shortly after is when we're going to see the birth of the Renaissance. But there's a couple of other things that we're going to have to deal with here with the breaking apart of the church and obviously the Black Plague as well. So what you're going to do now is you're going to complete an activity that's listed on your task for Classcraft, and I'm going to walk you through it here on the video first. The task is asking you to create a mini poster of the 100-Year War, and there's a checklist of all the things that I want you to have on that poster. Even though the instruction sheet tells you to put the poster on the back of the instruction sheet, please do not do that. I repeat, do not do that. Put it on the white paper that is up by my desk, and your 100-Year War posters are going to be page 8 in your portfolio. If you get done early, you should go back and work on your Two Crusades page, your Feudalism page, or your Charlemagne page, so that when you leave here on Friday, you have nothing undone for your portfolio so far. There are examples of the 100-Year War posters that students have made in the past on the front board. Feel free to go take a look at those. You may plug in while you work. Just make sure you actually get your work done. Thanks a lot, guys.